Oh, too dark. All right. All right. Okay, here we go. Always takes a second to get the live stream working for whatever reason. Just a bunch of steps. Okay, so today, we were talking last time. We're still working through concepts and theories. We've gone through a whole bunch of kind of economic and sociological concepts. So we're going to keep going through this today. I think I've got about 20 slides left. Try to get it so that we can finish up with this unit on Friday, if not today, but probably not today because I'm never as fast as I want to be. Okay, so I'm gonna go forward. Oh, he has the largest. Okay, so we're talking about Elon Musk. He is the largest individual stakeholder of Tesla at 13%. Thank you for that. All right, that was 2 lectures ago. We're gonna clear that off now. Sad, don't want to let it go, but there you go. Okay, so last time, right, we were talking about kind of different sociological perspectives on the economy. So we went through Durkheim and we went through Max Weber, and there are different kinds of perspectives on what's happening, and specifically Weber's, big focus on how important bureaucracy is in the functioning of more and more complex economies, right? And this is a big point for Max Weber. As economies get more and more complex, what we see is increasing need for managerial control through bureaucracy. And bureaucracy for Weber, most efficient way of organizing things. Again, clearly not a guy who had ever encountered a lot of bureaucracies. But specifically, what he thinks is it segments tasks up, much like the factory floor, into very small specialized tasks for management, right? And has very, very clear rules for who does what, how they do it, when they do it, and how you get promoted and all of this kind of stuff. Okay, so post-industrialism or the post-industrial age. Sometimes people are calling what's been happening since like roughly around 1990. The post-industrial revolution, particularly in the West. Okay, so one thing that's really clear is that, at least in the West, right? So you get this period starting in the late 18th century, right? The end of the 1700s, going to roughly kind of 1970 as the real high point in industrialization in the West, right? And the point between about 1950 and 1970 is probably its absolute high point. The West is producing absolutely everything. It produces all of its own stuff, and a really, really large percentage of the workforce is employed in manufacturing, right? And it's the big industry. This kind of comes to a stop in the 1970s, particularly, this sustained economic boom that started about 1940. Sorry, for some reason I can't write dates. 1945 kind of comes to a close somewhere around 1973, right? And so you'd had this kind of really long sustained economic boom, particularly in Canada and the US, but Western Europe and Japan as well, following the Second World War. And in 1973, it really kind of grinds to a stop. It's driven by a bunch of things. We'll talk about the growth of the welfare state in a couple of slides. The growth of the welfare state plays a big role. But you have other factors playing a role also. Highly indebted governments, an Arab oil embargo, right, that starts in the 70s. A lot of the Arab oil producing states object to the West's support of Israel over the Palestinians, and basically they restrict oil supplies to the West, which causes an energy crisis in the West. The price of energy goes way, way up, and you start to get what you always get when you get a skyrocketing cost of energy. You get recession, and in some cases, deindustrialization. And if you want to see a contemporary example of this, right, you can talk about Germany post-2022. So as Germany sort of weans itself off of cheap exports of Russian oil and gas, which it had been largely dependent on since the 1980s, as it, because of the Ukraine war, has weaned itself off, it's gone into a pretty sustained energy crisis. The cost of energy has gone way up, and you've seen, essentially a kind of slow motion deindustrialization of Germany happening in real time. Okay, so you get a bunch of shifts, right? So the kind of produced goods and jobs in manufacturing, through most of this period of 45 to 73 are relatively low-skilled manufacturing jobs, right? It would have been possible probably for, you if you were a young man graduating from high school, in this period to, get your high school diploma, walk yourself down to the Ford factory in Windsor, Ontario, or whatever equivalent wherever you were living, go talk to the foreman and be like, hey, I really need a job. And probably what they would have done is hired you, trained you on the job, because the skills required in a lot of these manufacturing settings were relatively low. This starts to change, as the economy gets more complex, as electronics become more sophisticated, as the computer revolution starts to kick off, manufacturing gets much more complex. So these jobs, which were referred to as blue-collar jobs, really start to become much more difficult to get, and there are cutbacks, right? There are layoffs, and there's a sort of slow motion deindustrialization that starts in the West. Okay. To a large extent, in this period especially, while you have lots of women working, the bulk of people working, especially in the industrial sphere, are men. Most women are in the domestic sphere, and it's only, well into the 1980s that we get sort of a majority of women, in the workplace. Though, there are women in the workplace all the time. Okay. So, post-1970, right? There's a shift in the developed world, right, or the West, away from heavy manufacturing. And there's a couple of things that happen, right? First, there's increasing automation. And this is, something that we're continuing to see, even more than, sometimes we blame, and, if you've been listening to Donald Trump, you shouldn't, but, if you are, he'll blame a lot of, America's economic woes and the unemployment of people, blue-collar workers, working-class people on, China, or offshoring. But one of the bigger things that's happened is automation, right? The automation of a lot of low-skilled manufacturing jobs, and especially, those that are dangerous or prone to injury, right? These are the kinds of jobs that get automated first. And in manufacturing, right, it shifts a lot to robotics doing a lot of these things. One of the kind of core examples of this is in auto manufacturing, the paint booth, right? The paints that you use on cars, because they're meant to last for a really, really long time, like car paint is amazing. Like you could put that stuff through a nuclear blast and you could still be like, oh, that car was blue, before it was scorched by an atomic bomb. It's like an enamel, it's crazy. But it's also unbelievably toxic when you're painting it on the car. So one of the things that used to happen is the guys who were in the paint booth right, spraying down the car and painting all the components, would tend to get cancer at really, really high rates. So things like that, right? Jobs that were pretty dangerous have largely been automated. Now, that wasn't a super high skilled job, right? Because you were there with a sprayer and spraying the color onto the car. Not a super high skilled job, one that used to be really well paying because it was extremely high risk. So a lot of these jobs start to disappear. Some of it, you know, especially in manufacturing, initially kind of goes to places like Japan. You know, Japan, one of its economic strategies, at least at first, is to produce, you know, a lot of these manufactured goods at really, really high quality. We'll get to Japanese management at the end of the course. It's a really cool kind of management style, and it's really interesting. But you know, they shift a lot of production over to Japan, and Japanese companies start to outcompete American companies, especially in electronics, right? And cars, electronics and cars. So you first get kind of a lot of manufacturing shifting over to Japan. As the Japanese economy develops and people demand higher wages, you eventually get shifts to other parts of the world, to China, of course, right? Everything's made in China, and Korea. You know, and increasingly now we're seeing it to other places like Bangladesh, and parts of Africa, right? We're starting to see a lot of heavy manufacturing move to parts of Africa, where wages are very, very low. So if you have low-skilled manufacturing, much better to do it in a very low-cost environment. Okay, yeah, so lots of pressure on manufacturing in the West, starting in the 1980s. Good jobs in Canada, the US, and the West start to require more and more education, right? And it goes from, you know, really what we'll call the base credential, right? So your base credential is the minimum education you need to get a good job. Up till like the 1970s, this was probably your high school diploma, right? Today, right, and as we've gone through, it's a 4-year bachelor's degree, right, of some kind. Okay, I mean, this by the way, is why we continue to have what is a slightly absurd cultural practice of celebrating, you know, having a big celebration when people graduate from high school, right? You know, I always find this funny, and obviously, like when I was 18, I was like, yeah, party, awesome, I'm done high school. That's an amazing accomplishment, sort of. Little did I know that I would spend, you know, a further 13 years of my life in some kind of education, and then by my own choice, permanently trap myself in an educational institution where I get older and everyone else stays the same age. Or at least that's my perception. But, right, it used to be, you got your high school diploma and you were off to the races, right? You were in the driver's seat in terms of earning potential, right? You were so far ahead of all those people who had dropped out and didn't have their high school diploma, right? So you could almost guarantee that you were getting a good job with that high school diploma, right? Your earning potential was going to be really high, right? You had kind of made it. And so, you know, people threw a big party because graduating from high school essentially meant that you were an adult, right? And then you would go do things like marry your high school sweetheart, you know, get a job at the factory, start having children, buy a house, get a car, all of that stuff that we associate with adulthood, right? That came out of, you know, the high school diploma, giving you a lot of that upward mobility. Obviously, that's not the case anymore, but we still celebrate graduating from high school like it's, you know, yay, you graduated from high school. Guess what comes next? More school, right? Which is pretty much where we're at now. So, all right, I think, have I killed everything on this slide? I think I have. Oh, I want to say a word about this because this is always kind of funny. Genuine fears in the 1980s and early 1990s that Japan might overtake the United States as the world's largest economy because Japan was growing so quickly. And so there was this particular controversy in the early 90s where the chairman and CEO of Nintendo, right, who, I can't remember his name now, it doesn't matter. He was a huge baseball fan, and Nintendo had been going gangbusters. So he had come over to Seattle, and he wanted to, you know, and the Seattle baseball team was perpetually in kind of financial distress, and he was making overtures to buy the Seattle baseball team. I think it's the Mariners now, but I can't remember what it was at the time. Um, and this caused a kind of national panic in the United States. Like, not only are the Japanese taking over the economy and they're going to be the biggest economy, not us, but they're buying our national game, right? They're going to buy the baseball teams away from good American owners. And, in good hysterical American fashion, there were congressional hearings about, this Japanese businessman's overture to buy a baseball team in Seattle, because how could we ever let, a foreign businessman, take over? And, much of the rhetoric that you're hearing today from the Americans about China, right, and the risk of China, if you've lived long enough, a lot of these are, repeats of things that people were saying about Japan in the 1980s and 90s, right? That there was this risk of Japan overtaking America and blah, 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 blah. So much of this, is and the protectionist measures that they're now talking about on China, they were talking about it with regards to Japan in the 80s and 90s as well. So, history might not repeat, but it rhymes. Okay, so Daniel Smith should pounce on the opportunity to sell oil to the Germans. That would be an excellent idea. If there was any way to get oil to the Germans, that would be fantastic. Aside from putting it on a train and actually like carting it physically across the country, which slightly increased the cost of it. If only someone had thought of building a pipeline to the east coast of Canada, a decade and a half ago. Oh wait, they did, and it got shot down by Quebec. Not even Quebec, the mayor of Montreal, apparently. So yeah, if only. What a brilliant idea that would be. Do I think the move away from the gold standard to fiat currency in the US in 1971 played a role in this societal restructuring? Okay, so I mean, if you don't understand this question, I'm assuming most people do. The American dollar used to be pinned kind of to the value of gold, right? It was on the gold standard. And under Richard Nixon, basically they moved the value of the US dollar to, a floating value, right? Basically, it's kind of pinned to the market and how much is available versus how much people will pay for US Treasury bonds and such. And, there's certainly some people, like libertarians, are like, we should go back to the gold standard. Though I'm not an economist, right? My general understanding of this has been that the shift away from the gold standard has been supremely beneficial to the American economy. It's allowed, for instance, the United States to borrow money at much, much lower cost, to at times devalue its currency, and essentially to make the US dollar not the gold standard, that would be nonsensical, the reserve currency of the world, where people buy the US dollar. So, I think it was more a function of what was happening rather than the cause of the restructuring. But certainly, right, it gave the U.S. a lot more flexibility in terms of its economic actions. Again, at least that's my understanding of it. Okay. So, in response to these kind of changes in the economy, increased global competition, right, at lower costs, the West essentially kind of jumps into a strategy and sort of the official policy of governments, really starting with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, is to not resist this transfer of manufacturing essentially from the West to East Asia and then to other parts of the world that are low cost, but instead to lean into what are considered higher value economic sectors, right? So in the West, a huge emphasis gets put on what are called white and pink collar jobs, right? So white collar would be your typical office worker, right? Like you think of the stereotypical person in an office cubicle wearing a white collared shirt. That's a white collar job, right? Programming, finance, management, engineering, biotech, this kind of scientific part of it. To some extent, higher ed would probably fall in here as well. And pink collar jobs, right? It's not meant to be sexist, but it generally denotes in economics jobs that have historically been female dominated, right? So things like healthcare, especially nursing, but increasingly kind of doctors as well, teaching, retail, sales, and any other thing that you can kind of think of that is, a service that people offer, right? So beauty, childcare, all of these things kind of fall into pink collar. And we'll talk about it later in the course, how a lot of these segments, in kind of things like pink collar work are often segmented into like the really high value and the really low value parts of the economy. But, like definitely a teacher or a professor or I should put like the big one here now is lawyer. Everyone wants to be a lawyer. At least in sociology, everyone wants to be a lawyer for some reason. Perhaps they've never met one. I don't know. I'm sorry if any of your parents are lawyers. That was a very mean comment. All the people I know who are lawyers, mind you, they're all involved in family law, and I think it's like crushed their souls. So, dealing with people, basically using their children as weapons in the divorce maybe hasn't made them have the highest view of humanity. I don't know. So all this stuff, like there's a huge lean into these things and a real push to restructure industries away from kind of working class jobs into these higher value jobs. Now, this doesn't, these jobs obviously require a lot more training and education, right? Usually a 4-year college or university degree, or at least something from a technical school like a polytechnic, something like NAIT. Blue collar work, right, comes to require more sophisticated training as well. And the percentage of blue collar workers decreases. So blue collar work, right, it's called blue collar work because people who worked in factories used to wear denim, right? So like they would actually wear denim shirts, right? So the collars were blue. And this kind of work, more working class, more manufacturing and construction, resource extraction, farming, right, starts to require more and more sophistication as well. Like even farming, which, the ability to operate and plan farms is now quite a technical thing because it's so technologically inclined. So yeah, the percentage of blue collar workers decreases in the West, and those that survive are principally those that are location specific and can't be outsourced, right? Plumbers, you're always going to need plumbers. They always have to be local because a Chinese plumber is not going to do you any good, when you have a pipe burst in your house. You need someone local. Same thing with carpenters, electricians, welders, right? But something that you can send that job over, to China or Korea, that is going to be easily outsourced, right? So there is still a blue collar trade, and blue collar jobs can pay really well. Like a journeyman plumber, can make easily, over 6 figures, right? Not like 500,000, but easily probably, $100,000 to $150,000 a year in terms of their kind of median wages. Again, it depends where you are. Alberta's higher than say Prince Edward Island, but they can do relatively well. But there's fewer jobs for them, and only those that are non-outsourceable are still kind of thriving. And even then, right, like it's 4 years of kind of apprenticeship at least to become a journeyman in any of these fields. So it's much more technical than it used to be. Okay, I should say maybe one more word here before I move on. It's only been 25 minutes. There's government pushes as well, really, to shift particularly industrial centers away from their traditional working class backgrounds to more advanced industries. And probably the best example of this is Pittsburgh. Home of the Penguins and Sidney Crosby, and also essentially the largest biomedical sector in the United States. Pittsburgh used to be a steel town, right? That's where, if you follow football, which I do not, you have the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers, not because they steal things, but because everybody in Pittsburgh used to make steel, right? It was a steel town. Today, Pittsburgh still has steel, but much less of it, but is dominated by its very advanced pharmaceutical and biomedical industries. And this was a specific policy of the state of Pennsylvania being like, look, if we leave Pittsburgh making steel, Pittsburgh's going to be Detroit, right? It's going to be half empty. It's going to be a decaying post-industrial city. So they shifted, basically, they put major tax incentives and investments into bringing in biomedical and pharmaceutical firms. And now, right, if you end up doing like biomedical engineering, there's a really good chance that you'll end up living in Pittsburgh. So, cool. The other thing that happened, right, some places really thrived out of this. Places, especially along the East Coast of the United States and the West Coast, seem to have done really well, right? Seattle's done fine, but Seattle sort of built itself into a programming hub, right? Partially because big companies like Microsoft, set up there. Sorry, there's a funny story about why Microsoft is in Seattle, and it is largely because Bill Gates is a huge jerk. So they were originally in Phoenix, Arizona. But Bill Gates was under the impression that people didn't work hard enough in Phoenix, Arizona because the weather was too nice, right? It's too sunny and warm. So he actually moved the company to Redmond, just outside Seattle, because he's like, it rains about 60% of the time in Seattle, so our employees won't be so motivated to go outside because the weather stinks, so they'll stay inside more and work. This is a true story. It's in his biography. He actually thought, he and Steve Allen both thought that, yeah, people weren't working hard enough in Phoenix, so they moved it to Seattle because it's gloomy and wet. And he figured that people would work more in gloomy, wet environments than in a sunny one where you want to go golfing all the time. So there you go. Bill Gates is a huge piece of garbage. Not only that, his treatment of women is appalling. But that's neither here nor there. Okay. So yeah, some places have done really well, especially on the coast. The middle part of the United States, right, that old industrial heart, particularly in the Midwest, has seen kind of constant economic crises, and just in the last probably 20 years, declining lifespans, right? As basically the people who live there have been unable to find work. A lot of them have gotten addicted to opioids, and really you've had a decay of the working class. So if you want to know where Donald Trump came from, it comes from all of this, right? It comes from this deindustrialization of the middle part of the United States and people getting really, really pissed off about it and electing anyone who will tell them things like, I will bring back American manufacturing, which probably isn't going to happen. And even if it did, American manufacturing today is super high tech, right? If you go look at like Boeing, Boeing does not, you can't have a high school diploma and work at Boeing, right? Although maybe that's a bad example. Maybe that's why all the Boeing planes are falling out of the sky. You shouldn't have a high school diploma and work at Boeing, right? It's incredibly high tech, right? It's incredibly precise, and so it requires a lot of skills. I keep using Boeing as an example because like 5 years ago, it seemed like Boeing was a good example of things, and increasingly it doesn't. But, only a few doors fell off their planes, no problem. In the air. On the ground, less of a problem. In the air, kind of a problem. Okay. So, some other theories, right? So this one from a guy named Richard Florida. And Florida has been a theorist of kind of the post-industrial transition and what it would look like. And basically, what he said, what he thinks is going to move the economy forward, and a lot of people, have kind of bought into Florida's ideas, has been what he said. Sorry, let me redo that sentence. He basically suggests that what is going to drive the economy forward for Western countries in the future is the growth of what he calls the creative class, right? And basically, these are your high-skilled, highly educated workers who are creating new industries, right? And he splits these into two categories, right? The super creatives and the creatives. So the super creatives, right? These are, now it's worth noting, I'll say this, when Richard Florida was writing this, it's about 2008. So what had happened the year prior, and one of the things I think Florida is really sort of resonating with is the launch of the iPhone, right? And everybody sort of looked at the iPhone when it launched as being like, wow, that's really cool. And as the iPhone sort of evolves, it opens up all these new industries around the iPhone, programming apps, all of this stuff. So, he split his, and so he's kind of reflecting this moment where like these revolutionary new technologies are appearing, and at a certain point, it feels like a revolutionary technology is appearing every other day, right? This is what it was like to live in the 2000s. So I remember reading this book when it came out. It's interesting. So it involves, a lot of occupations: science, engineering, programming, research, arts, right, to an extent, design and media. And basically what he says is the super creatives, right, their purpose is to be creative and innovative and create new industries, right? Not just to, solve problems, but actually find problems that need solving, right? What he suggests about the super creatives is they're not just looking at the world and seeing a problem to be solved. They're looking and saying like, hey, I see a problem that no one even knows is a problem, right? A technology that people haven't even dreamed of. And I'm going to create this thing to solve a problem people don't know that they have. Because when they see it, they're going to realize they've always had this problem. And now, I'm going to solve it. And here, like, I don't want to give the guy too much time in the class, but Elon Musk is probably like the archetype of the super creative, right? Whatever you think of him. I know lots of people don't like Elon Musk. I'm kind of neutral on the guy. I don't really care. But something like Starlink, right? Think about Starlink. Starlink is an attempt by Musk to solve a problem nobody ever really thought was that big of a problem, right? It's like, oh, do you want access to the internet through satellites constantly everywhere in a super fast way? Oh, well, I can do that. And they designed this, do you want a rocket ship that you could launch into orbit that could then land? The booster module, which we used to just dump in the ocean. You want it to land back on a platform? We can do that, right? So obviously, Elon's not doing that by himself. He has 100 million super smart people working with him. But this is like problem-solving things that people didn't know. The same thing with like, what's the guy's name? Johnny Ive at Apple, right? The guy who was really credited with all of the engineering stuff around the first several generations of iPhones. It was like, create a device that solves a problem people didn't even know they had, right? Having the internet in your pocket and all the capabilities that came with it was a problem. Like, people were like, yeah, that'd be cool, I guess. Apple made it real in a particular way, right? In a particular way to make it really, like, once you had a world with the iPhone, everybody realized how cool it was and realized that they wanted that thing, but no one was really thinking about it beforehand, right? Like, most people were like, I have my flip phone, it's great, I can call people. Maybe I'll send a text message now and then by pushing 1144445, right? You don't know because you've always had smartphones. Flip phones used to have to like multiply push the buttons to get a particular letter. It was super fun. It didn't take long at all. Okay, and then you've got your creative professionals, right? People in healthcare, business, financial. These are your highly skilled, and educated professionals who use knowledge to solve problems. Think of like, pharmaceuticals as one of the big fields here, medicine, right? Doctors and nurses who are seeing patients who are in ill health, and they're using their education to solve those people's problems, right? So you're presented with problems and then you solve them. Or lawyers, right? You're put, a legal question and you have to solve it using your intelligence. So this is what Richard Florida thinks is going to push the economy forward. Now, again, one of the problems and one of the critiques of Florida has been that this leaves a lot of people behind, right? Because not everyone can afford to go to college. Not everyone has the inclination to be a creative or a super creative, right? Some people are working class. So they like to work with their hands. And this kind of structure where we're going to tilt the economy to really benefit the creatives and super creatives leaves a lot of people behind. And one of the criticisms is that Florida doesn't really care about some of the class inequalities that this is bound to create, which I think is true. Richard's also a huge jerk. met him once, and he's a real piece of work. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, what Florida thinks is that creatives will gather in what he calls creative cities, right? So these would be places like, New York, LA, Seattle, maybe Austin. Austin's a pretty cool place. Houston, Toronto, Montreal. Okay, right? These kinds of places that gather these creative, super intelligent people. Now, he thinks, that they need a couple of things: tolerance, technology, and talent, right? So usually the places, so tolerance, right? Because these are creative people, they tend to be progressive. And this is relatively true of educated people on the whole. They also need kind of at least like a baseline technological infrastructure, right? So super high-speed internet, a lot of the infrastructure, and that stuff. And then talent. So they tend to be homes to major universities. Oops, I don't know what I did there. Universities, right? Important universities. Okay. And then the creatives have these values, right? Meritocracy, right? They want to rise up the ranks based on their achievements. Diversity. They like a lot of diversity, right? And they like tolerance, diversity, both racial, sexual, all of these things. And they're devoted to individuality. And they relocate to the places that have these things. So one of Florida's contentions is, look, if you want to be a city of the future, one of the global cities, you need to embody these kind of qualities, because that's what the super creative people will want. And this is true to a certain extent, right? A lot of people move to places like New York, LA, and Seattle because they embody these values, right? And because, along with that, they have these super creative industries. Okay. How am I doing for... I'm trying to remember how many slides I have. 68. And I have 12 minutes. All right, well, let's do a couple more. We'll kind of go from there. So, deindustrialization. So I talked about this in a second, right? Or I talked about it a second ago. Gosh, Wednesday. So deindustrialization, right? This is essentially when we talk about deindustrialization, it's just a decline in the percentage of people employed in manufacturing. Typically, it's the result of, plant closures, downsizing, and relocation. But the other thing we can't underestimate is automation. Automation has played a huge role in this as well. Okay. Increased interdependence and integration of global economies. Our next unit after this is globalization. We're going to talk about how we've created these integrated global supply chains that are really intricate. And now, most global economies are highly, highly integrated. Because of lower labor costs and weak regulations, Canada and the West have seen a lot of their industrial manufacturing leaving places like Mexico. I forgot to mention Mexico, right? Mexico has been a huge beneficiary of this shift, right? Not just China. Mexico kind of follows a China-like policy of having an economy that is partially based on manufacturing, partially based on tourism, and partially based on drugs. Not to put it too lightly. But Mexico, China, India, Vietnam have all invested in getting manufacturing from the West by offering cheap, large labor pools that are cheap, low levels of government oversight, and all of these things. You've also seen, job losses between nations, right? So between the U.S. and China, but also within nations, especially large nations. So, for example, auto manufacturing in the U.S. has been moving gradually away from the Rust Belt, right? Places like Detroit, to Alabama. And, Mississippi, Mississippi. Okay. Why? Well, specifically because these places have basically tried to do, in a sense, what Vietnam and China have done, offer big pools of labor for cheap. And specifically, we'll talk about unions later in the course. I'm always promising you things later in the course. I'm sorry. They're basically work to rule states, or right to work states, where they've passed laws specifically weakening unions and union membership and making it much easier for people not join unions, essentially creating a pool of much lower cost labor in those places, right? So you're much more likely now in the US to see auto manufacturing plants be set up in states like Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi than setting up in Detroit. And like Toyota, Honda, I think Nissan, Volkswagen, all have plants in Alabama and Mississippi. Okay. Oh, and increased in contract work. Specifically, right, what's kind of called precarious labor. Like more contractors, less employees, that have allowed companies specifically to save on things like benefits, right? You don't pay benefits to contract workers. You don't have to pay pensions. So you employ people on a kind of contract basis. So if you end up with people on a contract basis, if you want to get rid of them, you just cancel, you just pay out the contract, they're done, right? You don't have to rehire them. They don't have any permanent standing, so they can't go to like the Labor Relations Board or anything like that. And this has been a strategy that's increasingly working its way up into white collar work as well. You've probably noticed, being at the university, that there are a lot of precariously employed professors, right? Thank God that's not me anymore, but I was for a lot of years, right? Where basically people are just on contracts, or maybe they're contracted to offer a single course or a couple of courses a year. Basically, this is a way for the university to avoid hiring them, paying them benefits, and eventually having to pay them out a pension, right? So precarious work is working its way up into higher tiers of the economy. And trust me, it sucks to have a PhD and be precariously employed. Okay. So what happens to the undereducated working class when there's a move to higher tech industries? So how can this transition take place without leaving them behind? This is a problem that has yet to be solved by modern economics. One of the big things that's happened, how to put this, as jobs for especially blue-collar men, initially white men, but increasingly Black and Latino men as well, as those jobs have dried up, for those that just have a high school diploma, right? You're not working in a factory anymore. They've shifted to other industries where they can find work that typically don't pay that well, but don't require a lot of skill. So the number one employer of high school educated men basically men with a high school diploma or less in the United States today is truck driving, right? So a lot of men have gone to driving trucks. Now, of course, the problem comes, and the problem is coming. Automation is coming for that job too, right? It's only a matter of time before, so for example, right, there's all sorts of rules around trucking, right? They can only drive for 8 hours, they have to take so many breaks, and all of this stuff. It's eventually going to come that the technology for automated trucks is going to be good enough that basically those things can drive 24 hours a day, except when they need to refuel or recharge. They don't have to stop for someone to sleep. And all of those men who are currently employed driving truck are going to end up unemployed as well, right? So, not only is it leaving people behind, as technology moves forward, there's more and more risk that's going to leave more and more people behind and essentially leave them with nothing. So if you've heard about, people talking about offering people a universal basic income, right, where everybody would get enough to survive, it's because of this, right? Because we don't know and we don't have good solutions for how to bring up people with, say, who are not college educated, who are not maybe inclined to college education, but for whom the industries they used to work in have disappeared. We don't know what to do with them, right? And they vote for, Trump. Not that that's a bad thing. I actually really don't care. But, that populist movement around Trump is driven largely by these trends. Okay, how will AI factor into this? It seems to be replacing many creative jobs as well as writing, such as writing and programming. Yeah. So This is a genuine problem, and how shall I put it? A lot of the creative class that until now had been sort of looking at the blue collar class, and they were like, well, you just need to learn to code. And this was actually a thing on Twitter a few years ago, right? Well, if your job in the factory got eliminated, you need to learn to code. And now it's like, oh, actually, Chat GPT can code better than you can. And they're like, wait, no, that's not fair. We must stop this technology from emerging and taking my job. It's actually really interesting because AI has sort of suddenly awakened a lot of the creative class to the struggles of the working class, and the fact that these technologies may actually be good enough to get rid of things like computer programmers. You know, a lot of engineering might be doable. I'm sorry to say, might be doable by AI. I'm sure you'll all be fine. Everything will be great. I promise. Everything is wonderful. But yeah, it represents a genuine threat, right? This is a technology that could make unemployable a lot of people in the creative class. Now, other jobs are going to spring up, that relate to AI, right? And that relate to new industries that are created. And you're probably, as educated people, better positioned to walk into those jobs than someone with a high school diploma, but it is certainly a challenge. So, with that super depressing point, I don't have time to explain Keynesian economics. So why don't we leave it there, and we'll come back on Friday. We'll finish this up, and if we have time, we'll talk about globalization a bit. See you on Friday.